Hello everyone, Ace here, and today let's talk about something a little bit different. Specifically, let's talk about video game history. Now, admittedly, a lot of my videos do cover video game history in bits and pieces, such as, for example, the What Made It Great series or the Retro Game Repairman series. But for today, I'd much prefer to do something much more bigger picture. Instead, I'd like to talk about how gaming itself was in general during the 6th generation, and how rapidly gaming culture changed in that particularly short time span. Now, for those who don't know, technically the 6th generation of consoles began all the way back in 1998 with the Japanese release of the Sega Dreamcast, and ended roughly around 2005 with the release of the Xbox 360. For the purpose of this video, however, I'll mainly start with the year 2001, as that was the year that saw the release of the Game Boy Advance, the GameCube, and the original Xbox, and of course end in 2005 with the release of the Xbox 360. Though of course I will be referencing both older and newer games where I feel appropriate. So really we're going to be focusing on just 4 years, and how these 4 years were some of the most transformative years in video game history. But to understand what I'm talking about, let's go back to 2001 and talk about what gaming was like in that year. And while at least some, if not most of this, is going to be fairly common sense, I do hope there's going to be plenty here that younger viewers may not necessarily know. For a start, let's talk about the business side of gaming, because that is something that a lot of people who were alive back then remember quite fondly, and for very good reason I might add. Now, it is admittedly true that during the early and mid-90s, games were often more expensive than what you might expect, with some games costing you about $60 or $70 in 1990s money. However, there are a few tidbits to keep in mind. For a start, while this was absolutely the case in the mid and late 90s, by the late 90s the prices had largely stabilized, and by the early 2000s the typical asking price for a AAA game on console was $50. And note that I have to be specific about it being on console, because PC gamers tended to get something of a discount in this regard. The typical AAA PC game usually released with an asking price of $30 or $40 at that point. And it's also worth noting that this price tended to drop rather rapidly, to the tune that in the early 2000s a PC gamer could expect to find a AAA release that was 1 year old selling for between $10 to $20. Or if the PC game happened to have expansion packs, you might be expected to spend $30 or $40 to get the base game plus the expansion packs, as well as most likely a few additional goodies as well. Also, to provide some clarity, for those who don't know what an expansion pack is, it was the 90s and early 2000s terminology for what we today call DLC. Except these expansion packs tended to be much larger on average than what you might expect for a DLC. Consider, if you will, the example of the Secret Weapons of World War II expansion for Battlefield 1942, which released with 8 brand new maps, with a 9th being added in a patch, as well as 13 new vehicles and 8 new weapons on release, with a further 5 new vehicles added in a further patch. I want you to keep these numbers in mind, because this expansion pack, when it was released, was actually criticized for being too light on content, just to highlight what the standard was for expansion packs in the early 2000s. And yes, while this expansion pack did cost $20 on its own to acquire, the trade-off was that you tended to get much more content. Some of these expansions were in fact so massive that they even ended up being standalone titles, meaning that you didn't even require the original game to play them. A good example of this was the Cossacks Back to War standalone expansion, which offered the player 2 additional new armies to play as well as over 200 standalone single-player missions. Another good example would of course be the Stronghold Crusader standalone expansion to Stronghold, which in addition to nearly doubling the game's unit roster, also included several brand new campaigns set during, you guessed it, the Crusades, giving the player several dozen new missions to dig their teeth into. And that's not even before mentioning the brand new skirmish mode, with a couple dozen more missions being added via the Stronghold War Chest re-release. But getting back to the topic of pricing for PC games, it's even worth mentioning that a lot of times patient gamers could simply wait for a bundle to appear, which included multiple games, all in one neat little package, once again for a fairly cheap price. One minor example of this being bundles such as this one, which allowed players to pick up Tropico plus its expansion pack, along with Stronghold, admittedly without its expansion pack, for $10. Typically, these releases were the cheap jewel case options, which for what it's worth tended to have the downside of missing some of the physical goodies that players might expect if they picked the big box options, such as the big beefy manuals for example, and instead those manuals might be digital copies, but nevertheless they were an option for gamers who wanted to game on the cheap. Speaking of which, allow me to provide a quick tangent on the topic of manuals for PC games, which on the surface admittedly may seem like a small topic and waste of time, but I do feel is worth mentioning at least somewhere. Simply put, PC game manuals back in those days were quite massive and robust, providing so much information that they ended up being worthwhile reading material in their own right. Consider, if you will, the extreme example that was Falcon 4.0 from 1998, a game whose main manual, as in the largest out of 4 different manuals the game came with, was so massive that it actually doubled as the game's box, being a massive 3-ring binder with a nifty little compartment to store the jewel case. In fact, if you were a PC gamer back then and were getting ready to do a road trip, it wasn't exactly a bad idea to buy a brand new game, partially for the purpose of having some decent reading material on that road trip. It's also worth noting that it wasn't exactly unheard of for gold edition versions of games to not only include all of the expansion packs, but also sometimes include full strategy guides, in addition to the manuals adding even more reading material. I personally spent countless hours reading both the manuals and strategy guides to both Empire Earth and StarCraft in prep class, during my free time, of course. So yes, video game manuals, at least for PC, absolutely were a big deal back in the early 2000s. But as I've said, if you didn't need a full copy of the physical manual, then the jewel case was very much a reliable, cheaper option, which still typically included a smaller but still usable physical manual tucked into the front of the jewel case. All of this is to say that playing video games was a significantly cheaper hobby back then, and that's before discussing options that allowed gamers to avoid the full sticker price. Case in point, let's talk about the rental scene, which allowed gamers to play the newest and best games for a fraction of the full asking price, at least for a few days anyways. For those who don't know, you were usually expected to return what you rented within 3 days. Now doubtless even newer gamers have been at least made aware of the rental scene. What you may not expect, however, was just how pervasive it was. Yes, everyone has heard of Blockbuster and Hollywood Video. However, these tended to be the more high-end options as far as rental locations. That's not to say that it was only for the upper class. Absolutely anyone could afford renting a movie from Blockbuster, after all. What I do mean, though, is that you went to Blockbuster and Hollywood Video specifically to rent movies or video games, usually on the weekend. And yes, I know that is an obvious thing to point out. What I'm getting at, though, is that if you didn't want to drive all the way out to your nearest Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, well, you didn't have to in order to rent things. For you see, usually your local grocery store would have a dedicated rental section for both movies and video games, meaning that you could just rent a video game while you're getting your groceries. And for those who are curious, while it is indeed true that the selection at the grocery store was typically far less impressive than what you could find at a Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, it still tended to be fairly robust, giving you a fairly sizable choice in terms of what game you want to rent. And if even that was too inconvenient, you could still find alternatives, as even gas stations were known to have movies and games that you could rent, though admittedly that tended to be far less common and instead was typically done in more rural areas. But the point I'm getting at is that the rental scene was simply everywhere during the early 2000s. It absolutely was a massive part of the video game industry, which is why it was a big deal when games such as Bloodwake from 2001 outperformed Halo in terms of the rental scene. Admittedly, the rental scene did not apply to the PC market, but there tended to be alternatives, at least as far as PC gaming was concerned as well. The most obvious alternative, of course, being the used gaming scene. Now, admittedly, this was significantly less common for PC gaming, but did, of course, happen. And yes, I am well aware of the fact that the used gaming scene is still a big deal today. In fact, even arguably a bigger deal than it was back then. However, while the modern used gaming scene is more for buying retro games, the used gaming scene back in the early 2000s was as much for buying new titles as it was for buying old ones. Though there was, of course, still a reason why early GameStops during the early 2000s still often stocked NES and Super NES titles. Of course, another factor that further reduced costs for the end user had to be the competition that existed at that time. One such example that comes to mind is the arcade scene. Now yes, by the early 2000s, the golden age of arcade machines was well and truly over. That isn't to say that they were rare at that point though, but rather that they had already peaked, and were on a slow but noticeable decline. The arcade machines themselves were still everywhere, as you could typically find them not only in your local grocery store, but also the movie theater or the local pizza place. Admittedly, this latter option is still typically a thing, but it is also worth noting that during the early 2000s, arcade games were trying to become more complex in order to compete with the rest of the market. A good example of this was the Sumo arcade cabinet, which included games such as MechWarrior 4 and the original Crimson Skies. So yes, an arcade machine that had one of the most beloved mech sims of all time on it, as well as one of the most unique and beloved arcadey air combat games as well. It is worth noting though that the arcade machines at this point were primarily competing with the mobile market for attention, as that was the only real alternative that gamers had when it came to playing on the go. Indeed, when it came to a gamer's ideal notion of having a night out on the town, the image in that era could be best described as sitting at your local pizza joint, having a good time with all your buddies, playing some MechWarrior 4 on an arcade cabinet, while a nearby TV is showing off episodes of the original Dragon Ball. I cannot stress enough just how much of a blast the whole thing was. And of course that moves me on quite cleanly onto the subject of multiplayer. And simply put, with the sole exception of PC gaming, and by 2002 Xbox Live, split screen was very much the rule of the day back then. In fact, even within the realms of PC gaming, there were still the occasional games that offered split screen support, and outside of that, LAN parties were also very much a thing as well. Because of course back then, not everyone had internet, much less high-speed internet. Ironically enough, the lack of reliable internet led to a number of unique facets when it came to the video game industry of that era. For a start, let's talk about game journalism, a topic that definitely has a soured reputation these days, but it is nevertheless worth remembering why game journalists used to be taken seriously, or at least more seriously than now. Because yes, for what it's worth, video game journalists even back then could accurately be described as something of a glorified marketing arm, especially when it came to console exclusive publications such as Nintendo Power or the official Xbox magazine, or indeed G4TV when it became a thing back in 2002. That said, these magazines and G4TV did ultimately offer players information about the latest releases, be it previews, reviews, or anything of the like. For what it's worth, it's also worth noting that G4TV was something of a pioneer when it came to its reviews and previews, what with the critics getting into costumes and putting on a show, in a manner not too different from the likes of the Angry Video Game Nerd or Nostalgia Critic, though the G4TV video articles tending to last a significantly less amount of time. When it came to the magazine side of game journalism, it's worth noting that these magazines often, though not always, offered more than just the magazine itself. For example, the official Xbox magazine typically came complete with a monthly demo disc, giving gamers access to various game demos, as well as previews, video reviews, and later on DLC, all for the asking price of $10 per issue. When it came to PC dedicated magazines, such as for example Maximum PC, the demo discs for those magazines tended to also include patches for existing games, as well as driver updates for people who wanted to update their drivers but didn't have easy access to the internet. There is, however, one piece of the video game journalism magazine market that many people may overlook or may not realize was a thing back then, that being video game magazines dedicated specifically to the topic of cheat codes. The most famous example, of course, being Tips and Tricks, which leads me quite cleanly into the topic of cheat codes in general, which is to say they became something of a notable cottage industry in their own right, not only thanks to publications such as Tips and Tricks, but also dedicated cheat code books that more resembled phone books than anything else, as well as of course dedicated cheat code hardware such as Game Shark and action replay. Admittedly, the early 2000s were slightly past the golden age of cheat codes that was the late 90s, but they nevertheless were still a significant part of the industry at that time. And once again, the fact that not everyone had access to internet at all meant that publications such as Tips and Tricks remained a useful resource for many a gamer, who after beating the game simply wanted to goof off with some hidden goodies, like making the bad guys wear funny hats, or getting access to unique items that you otherwise wouldn't get access to. I believe now is a good time though to double back to something I already mentioned earlier, that being the subject of demo discs, because when it comes to PC gaming especially, they weren't exclusive to video game journalism magazines. In fact, your regular PC game at the time would usually come with a few extra goodies on the disc, typically in the form of a few demos or the odd trailer or two. One good example of this would be Pearl Harbor Zero Hour, published by Simon & Schuster, which just so happened to include a demo of Real War on the disc. Pick any PC game from that era, and chances are pretty solid that there would be a demo or trailer for another game on the disc. In some cases, the developers would even take it a step further and create a free full-fledged game just to advertise a much larger game. A good example of this is Firefly Studios' simple but nevertheless fun and solid Castle Attack, which itself was made to advertise the aforementioned Stronghold. And if getting free demos from the games and magazines that you bought wasn't enough, there were also dedicated demo discs you could buy separately as well, mainly for PC, although some discs did exist for consoles as well. Specifically, I'm talking about the 100 games in one, 300 games in one, 1000 games in one, 500,000 games in one, and etc. collections that you would find, usually with a $10 or $20 price tag. These typically were a compilation of various game demos, along with a few full budget titles that you could try, and were a go-to method for indie devs to get their games out onto the market at a time when the main barrier was being able to get your physical copy onto store shelves. With that in mind, why not pool your resources with other indie devs with the hope of enticing gamers to potentially pick up your full game? For those curious, the way that was typically done is once the demo was finished, the player would be prompted with a screen asking them to potentially buy the full game, which could be accomplished via the internet if possible, or if not, via snail mail. And yes, for the record, the demos themselves could be from games that really did run the gamut in terms of production quality, as one could find a demo for Hidden and Dangerous, Master of the Skies The Red Ace, and Codename Eagle all on the same disc. Speaking of demo discs, I believe now's a good time to circle back to the original Xbox, and how demo discs for it allowed players to access DLC they might not be able to otherwise had they not had the internet. I bring this up because there was in fact another option as well at the time, namely bringing your memory card to the nearest demo station. Because yes, it was a built-in feature that Microsoft intended to walk up to the demo station at your local Walmart and simply use it to download DLC straight to your memory card. So yes, as you can tell, there was a massive amount of effort from a logistical standpoint to try to get gamers access to the games and content they might want to try. This was, unsurprisingly, even reflected in the amount of shelf space that these games tended to take up. Circa 2001, for example, the PC gaming section at your local Walmart would typically be an entire aisle, with both sides of the aisle being dedicated specifically just to PC games. Often, but not always, also with a demo station to boot, though admittedly the demo station for PC games typically only had trailers rather than actual playable demos. Unsurprisingly, the console and handheld sections tended to be similarly sized as well. It's also worth noting that a number of stores that you don't really see stock video games these days absolutely did back in those days by contrast. For example, your local Staples or Big Lots would absolutely have a video game section, which at the time included both console and PC games. There is another additional thing I do need to bring up when it comes to PC gaming in this regard though, that being just how many stores carried PC games but didn't necessarily carry console games. Because yes, sure, back then you could absolutely find both in your local Circuit City, Best Buy, or Toys R Us, but there were even dedicated hardware stores which still had a dedicated PC gaming shelf section, Menards being one example in that regard, which again highlights just how much effort was put into making it so that these games could get into the hands of gamers. This, I believe, sums up reasonably well the marketing and pricing of video games at that time, as well as their overall pervasiveness. So considering all of that, I believe now is a good time to move on to the subject of innovations that occurred in that era. Let's talk about things that forever changed the video game industry. And on that subject, 2001 ended up becoming one of the greatest years in video game history. This was, after all, the year that gave us games such as Halo, Grand Theft Auto 3, Silent Hill 2, Advance Wars, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, Tropico, IL-2 Sturmovik, Ghost Recon, and the original Operation Flashpoint. All of these are great games well worth talking about in their own right. But adding to this, though, was the context at play here. It's important to keep in mind what was popular at that time, and how some of these games fundamentally changed the video game market. I suspect some people already know the fact, for example, that platformers were still seen as the default genre for video games, at least on console. 2001 was, after all, also the year that gave us Conker's Bad Fur Day, as well as the first Jak and Daxter game. One of the things that major consoles were obsessed with in the lead up to 2001 was, of course, mascot games, i.e. games that were associated with one specific system. Of course, the most famous and classic example of this was, at the time, Mario being associated with Nintendo. But you could also look at examples such as Sonic being associated with the Sega Dreamcast, at least while the Dreamcast was still somewhat relevant at that point. You could also somewhat look at Spyro and Crash Bandicoot being associated with the original PlayStation, though during the 6th generation, both of those franchises would start branching out and appearing on competitors' systems as well. The point I'm driving home here, though, is that mascot games, namely mascot platformers, were absolutely something that console producers believed were an absolute necessity for their console to be successful. The original Xbox, with its early notable titles such as Halo and Bloodwake, completely changed all of that. Microsoft's brand new console was quickly gaining a rather unique reputation. The Xbox, right out of the gate, became known as the system for action games specifically, with Master Chief quickly becoming the mascot of the system, despite being from a first-person shooter series rather than a platformer series. One is most certainly left to wonder how different things may have been had Halo been an RTS as was originally intended by Bungie. But of course, that is a discussion for another time. One thing that is worth bringing up here and now, however, is the fact that this was such an unprecedented outcome that even Microsoft wasn't fully on board with the idea of Master Chief becoming their new mascot. Which is why for the next few years, Microsoft did try to create a proper platformer mascot for the Xbox, most notably Blinx the Time Sweeper as well as Voodoo Vince, both of whom got some absolutely fantastic games in 2002 and 2003 respectively. Even by that point, though, the reputation of the original Xbox was, like I said, pretty much set in stone. And needless to say, this had a massive impact on the video game industry as a whole. Yes, the Xbox wasn't the most successful console of the 6th generation. However, the popularity of Master Chief was so great that it did directly lead to the FPS title becoming the main genre on console games, with both Sony and even Nintendo trying to create their own mascot action games, with Sony producing Killzone, while Nintendo created both Metroid Prime and the Battalion Wars games. Of course, this is not the only reason why we should remember the original Halo as an important piece in video game history. It also, after all, provided some notable innovations, such as the regenerating shields mechanic, and also the fact that it was one of the first FPS games that combined vehicle combat with solid indoors fighting as well. Previous FPS titles tended to do one or the other, but struggled with doing both. Speaking of games that managed to combine multiple forms of gameplay together, let's move on to the importance of Grand Theft Auto 3, the game that most people considered to be the first modern sandbox title. A game and genre that was a product of nearly a decade of steady evolution up to that point, which can be traced not only to previous Grand Theft Auto games, but also other franchises that inspired it, such as the Strike franchise and the Return Fire franchise. In truth, the steady evolution into what became the sandbox genre is a topic that could be potentially well worth another video should I try to do another long-form essay such as this. What is worth mentioning here, however, is that Grand Theft Auto 3 was such an important title that it may have actually helped lead to the downfall of an entire genre of video games that up to that point were actually quite popular, namely the vehicle combat genre, of which the Twisted Metal franchise was no doubt the most famous, but also sold numerous other franchises such as the Vigilante 8 franchise, the Battle Tanks franchise, and yes, even the aforementioned Bloodway. wake. But thanks to the release of games such as Grand Theft Auto 3 and Halo, had to actively compete with other genres of games that could do the same things as well as more on top of them, even if admittedly less focused when it came to the vehicle combat department. Games that specialized in vehicle combat became less and less common, in direct inverse to the proportion of games that released with both vehicle combat and on-foot combat. Speaking of both Grand Theft Auto 3 and the original Halo, now's the perfect time to deviate to another bigger picture issue when it came to the video game industry at that time, the whole violent video game discourse, which for those who don't know was the notion that video games caused violence in the real world. A debate that admittedly was raging even back in the early 90s with the release of games such as Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and the original Desert Strike, but a debate that nevertheless became more pitched and heated following tragedies such as Columbine and the DC Sniper. Unfortunately, this has resulted in a fair amount of misinformation with regards not only to the reputation of video games, but also in terms of the political reaction towards video games from various parties. To start off with dispelling the myth that was common at the time, no, violence in video games did not result in an uptick of real-world violence. In fact, amusingly, violent crime was very much on the decline at this stage, at least in the US, despite out-of-touch boomers believing that Mario was causing kids to jump on turtles. I don't believe I have to explain much more on why violence in video games does not result in real-world violence, because unless you believe that literally everything is political, and thus believe that politics in video games can somehow radicalize someone into violent acts, so long as you don't believe that ridiculous notion, then you'll long understand that the idea that video games cause violence is simply not true. There is, however, another element of misinformation which I do believe warrants further discussion on this subject. That being the idea that the Democrats in the US were somehow the good guys and protectors of free speech when it came to the violent video game discourse at that time. The simple fact of the matter is that they weren't. And this is not to defend the Republicans. They themselves absolutely weren't friends of video games either. To pretend, though, that the Democrats were somehow the good guys in this discussion, or even the lesser evil, is simply not the case. Yes, I'm well aware of the fact that Jack Thompson and Fox News exist. That does not excuse the fact in any way that the people who were originally leading the charge in trying to censor video games in the US were news stations such as MSNBC and its affiliates, along with Democrats such as Joseph Lieberman and Hillary Clinton. It especially does not excuse the fact that the political party that actively pushed laws to try to censor video games was ultimately the Democrat Party, who created numerous laws to try to legally enforce the ESRB rating system, legally requiring IDs to purchase M-rated games. There were attempts at the federal level, such as the Family Entertainment Protection Act of 2005, pushed by the aforementioned Hillary Clinton and Joseph Lieberman, alongside Evan Bayh, all three Democrats. But fortunately, this particular attack on free speech failed to actually pass. At the state level, however, the Democrats were ultimately more successful, with one of the more infamous success stories for them being AB 1179, a California state law that pretty much did the same things as the Family Entertainment Protection Act, but for the state of California. It wasn't until 2011 that this particular law was finally struck down by the US Supreme Court in their decision of Brown versus the Entertainment Merchants Association, on the grounds that it was a violation of the First Amendment. It's also worth noting, by the way, the person that was in charge of defending this particular unconstitutional piece of legislation was none other than Kamala Harris. So yes, the public image that the Democrats at that time were the heroes and defenders of free speech and protectors of video games is blatantly false. And this becomes even more apparent when discussing the censorship taken and promoted by more left-wing parties in other countries. Case in point, let's talk about the Germans, who were extremely censorship happy in the early 2000s, despite being more politically left than the United States at the time, which of course directly contradicts the notion that the political left was the side of free speech at the time. And yes, while most people are familiar with the fact that the Germans were especially censorship heavy towards violence, though I will at least say that the German government in the 2000s was far less extreme in this regard in comparison to the West German government of the 80s, but it is also worth mentioning that the German government was extremely politically biased in terms of what got censored and what didn't. Yes, most people are familiar with the fact that swastikas were simply banhammered in Germany at the time, but to provide another separate example, consider the 2001 release of Tropico, which saw numerous examples of censorship in the German version. Examples of censorship that were very clearly politically aligned, because while some historical dictators, such as Noriega, Papa Doc, and Pinochet, were completely censored from the German version of the game, other, more notably leftist historical dictators, such as Castro and Guevara, curiously remained completely uncensored, despite the fact that both of those historical figures killed far more many people. Because in the eyes of the German government at that time, it's okay when communists do it. So given the actual facts of the matter, one may be wondering why Republicans were the ones that got such a negative reputation at the time, while Democrats were somehow allowed to skirt by and be portrayed as the good guys and the protectors of free speech. Well, there are a few factors at play. For a start, it is worth noting that the Republicans themselves were not champions of free speech in this situation. As I mentioned, plenty of Republicans were still trying to blame video games for violence, even though in terms of actual policy, the Republicans were far more passive. So yeah, the Republicans weren't good guys in this situation. As far as the reason why they tend to get more flack, well, there are two factors at play here. For a start, the Republicans who were focused on blaming video games for violence tended to stick around and keep blaming video games long after everyone else had dropped the issue. Both Fox News and Jack Thompson kept railing against video games up into the late 2000s, long after studies started coming out showing that violent video games are not to blame for real-world violence. Basically, because Fox News and Jack Thompson kept harping on this issue much later than everyone else, the public memory of this particular debate remembers Republicans complaining most recently, and thus most freshly in everyone's mind. The second factor at play here is the rhetoric itself that the Republicans and the Democrats utilized. Whenever a Columbine sort of situation happened, the Republican response was to blame video games as a scapegoat, and then not really do anything as far as actual legislation. By contrast, the Democrat response was to blame firearms and video games, and apparently believing these to be legitimate causes, actively try to pursue active legislation against both. However, the fact that the Republicans were far more focused and needled in on video games specifically with their rhetoric also played a huge role in why they're seen historically as the greater evil when it comes to the violent video game debate, despite the actual facts of that era completely contradicting that notion. And again, this isn't to say that the neocons were innocent. They weren't. It is, however, important to not let the Democrats slide with the things that they did, which were objectively worse. In all honesty, the history of the violent video game debate is something that does, I believe, warrant a full-fledged video in its own right. And so if this video does well, maybe I'll do that in the future as well at some point. Just consider this little deviation in this video to be more a Cliff Notes version, because let's face it, an in-depth look at that topic would cover a significantly larger span of time than what I'm doing today. But if you still aren't convinced, allow me to provide here a few additional tidbits of video evidence, in the form of videos from ABC News, a left-wing TV source, and Fox News, and how they both covered the release of the original Mortal Kombat. And yes, I know both of these videos are from before the time period that I'm talking about, but they do provide an excellent example. All I ask is that you compare these two news stories and see which one, in your opinion, is the more extreme and more anti-video game in their coverage.
A fantasy martial arts game that some parents think is just too violent for their kids. Carol Lynn joins us live now from Northridge with more on that story. Carol?
Here it is, Bob, behind me. It's called Mortal Kombat, and we're going to talk to Aaron Brandis here about the game. Aaron, how does it work?
Well, basically, you pick a couple characters, you do maneuvers on the joysticks and buttons, you do moves, and
And then
whoever
what are you trying
wins.
to get to? Fatality?
Nah, there's a master guy you got to beat at the end. Fatalities are just what happens if you're really brutal to your opponent. You get an opponent, you can rip off his head or something like that.
Sounds like a pretty thrilling game, and this is the kind of violence that critics are pretty worried about. Cold-blooded murder is making Mortal Kombat the most popular video game in history. Kids relish their victory and their bloody choice. Should they pull out their opponent's heart? Or simply rip his head off just to see his spinal cord dangle in a pool of blood? How do you feel about cutting his head off? One. After a $10 million advertising campaign, Mortal Kombat, debuting in home video today, is expected to sell 2 million copies at $50 a pop. A horrifying possibility for parents who can't believe the game makers are fantasizing about decapitation and murder.
I don't think they'll have this at home, no.
You don't think so?
A little bit
you
too
look
violent.
a little startled.
Yeah, it's a little too violent, I think.
That's pretty bad, and that's just plain gross.
Furthermore, advanced technology allows digitized video of real martial arts actors, making the action look real and not as cartoony. In fact, Mortal Kombat so shocked the managers at a nationwide arcade chain, that they tried a sanitized version of the game. Instead of chopping the opponent's head off, he simply disappears. Sales dropped 40%.
They came up and said, what'd you do to the game? It's no fun anymore.
Kids are saying chill out to worried parents.
I think TV personally influences more than a video game. A video game is a video game.
The bottom line, parents wonder if kids can separate fantasy from the real thing.
Wait until they get out in a situation where they're fighting, and then they'll think about this and try to make it real.
But you know, game makers are saying that games are going to become more visually violent and more sexually violent as adults buy more video games. I mean, it's a big money market, $50 to $60 a pop. Plus, some of the critics say, or they at least concede, that parents have to be there in order to pay for the game, so at least there's some discretion there. And game makers are also talking about a new rating system similar to the movies. We'll see what happens. I'm Carol Lynn reporting live from Northridge. Back to you.
All right.
Christmas stocking. Video games have become a $4 billion a year business, and a great many children, as you parents know, have put them on their Christmas lists. As ABC's Bill Greenwood reports, there is a growing concern on Capitol Hill that parents who buy some of those games may not realize just how much violence they're getting.
One of the most vicious games is called Mortal Kombat. The objective is to finish off your opponent violently. Another method is decapitation. Critics, including the National PTA, say such video games contribute to violence in real life. And television's Captain Kangaroo says parents are not paying enough attention.
Understand that these are not harmless toys, that they can indeed cause great emotional and other damage to a child.
Congress will be asked to establish a rating system to protect children from gruesome games.
We now require warning labels on toys that can potentially damage children's bodies. Why not do so on a toy that can damage their minds?
Barry Rhodes bought the game anyway, since it takes a special code to activate the violent scenes, which he says are a part of life.
It's there, so I'm not going to try to hide my daughter from that.
Even so, the giant Sega Corporation recently introduced a voluntary system to rate video games for use by a general audience, those over 13 and over 17. But there are lots of places where youngsters can play video games without such guidance or adult supervision. So next week, the U.S. Senate will conduct hearings on ways to supervise the video industry. Bill Greenwood, ABC News, Washington.
And that is our report on World News Tonight. Later on.
So yeah, as you could probably tell, even back then, the left-wing news media coverage was noticeably more anti-video game than right-wing news media coverage was. Though again, both of them were still anti-video game, admittedly. Getting back to gaming in the year of 2001, however, let's move away from the software innovations and politics of the era, and instead onto something from a hardware standpoint that also had a massive impact. One key feature I believe a lot of people may overlook, from a hardware standpoint, occurred fairly early on in the history of the 6th generation. Let's talk about one of the greatest success stories when it comes to the history of motion controls. In fact, the first big success story for motion controls, and a direct ancestor to the VR of today. Namely, let's talk about TrackIR. For those who don't know, TrackIR, at least in its original form back in 2001, was meant as a motion control system to enable people with physical disabilities to use the computer more effectively. The way this works is that TrackIR had a sensor that detected head movement and moved the mouse in accordance with your head's movement. An unintended feature of this, however, is that if you happen to play flight simulators, for example, which were still a popular genre at the time on PC, then you could use your head to simply look around on the screen, because at that point, most flight simulators use the mouse as a free look function, enabling the player to look around and spot enemy aircraft, as well as maintain awareness of their surroundings so they don't go careening into a mountain or something. Keep in mind, situational awareness was something that the flight sim genre as a whole was obsessed with maximizing as much as possible. TrackIR allowed players to take their hand off the mouse, allowing their second hand to be utilized for things like throttle control. This is on top of the fact that physically moving your head and looking around to scan the skies was a more immersive experience in its own right. So yes, Track IR was a unique situation where the motion controls were not only more immersive, but also a very practical solution to the problem of being able to look around in a flight sim, meaning that it was a motion control system that managed to completely avoid getting the reputation of being a gimmick that later implementations of motion controls such as the Wii would acquire years later. While its use was admittedly niche, it was nevertheless extremely successful in that particular niche. Needless to say, the people behind Track IR quickly capitalized on the accidental success they had found and rebranded their product as the flight simmer's friend that it absolutely was. It was so successful that it quickly became a cardinal sin for flight sims to not support Track IR. And its dominance over the flight sim industry only truly became challenged with the proper implementation of VR much later on. So yes, when it comes to the software and the hardware side of things, 2001 was an extremely important year, not only determining what kinds of games were going to be made for the next several years, but also laying the groundwork for what was to come in terms of hardware as well. With that in mind, let's talk about some of the important events that happened in 2002, a year that I believe is unfairly overlooked sometimes. For a start, if you were an FPS fan in 2002, then you had an absolutely fantastic year, as this was the year that gave us games such as Metroid Prime, Medal of Honor Allied Assault, Medal of Honor Frontline, 007 Nightfire, Battlefield 1942, Time Splitters 2, No One Lives Forever 2, and MechAssault. Needless to say, FPS fans were absolutely spoiled for choice when it came to classic titles to play. Though one thing I will mention, although perhaps not necessarily that obvious here, is that 2002 could be seen as something of the start of the golden age for World War II themed FPS games. There were obviously earlier FPS games set in World War II, but 2002 really saw the floodgates open, because again there were two separate Medal of Honor games as well as Battlefield 1942 all released in the same year. Amusingly enough, also by the same publisher, EA. So needless to say, this obviously set the tone for FPS games for the immediate future, but this was also a year that laid down some significant groundwork that would have a much bigger impact on the industry later on as well. So let's move on to the big hardware innovation that first became properly launched in 2002, Xbox Live. Now, for what it's worth, Microsoft's Xbox was not the first console to try its hand at online gaming, as the Sega Dreamcast also attempted this feat. However, the experiments by Sega's Dreamcast were ultimately unsuccessful in this regard due to a number of factors, including that system being built around the idea of using dial-up instead of much faster means of connection. By contrast, the Xbox and Xbox Live as a Service were built around the notion of utilizing proper high-speed internet connection. And while it did take Microsoft a year to actually implement this feature into the Xbox itself, it was nevertheless an immediate game changer for the system. And thanks to the fact that games such as MechAssault launched with support for Xbox Live, guaranteeing an excellent killer app for people who wanted to try out online gaming for consoles, Microsoft had effectively set in stone the future of multiplayer gaming on consoles right then and there. MechAssault not only proved to be a massive success, but also laid the groundwork for post-game support in the form of DLC on consoles. An innovation that was, in retrospect, perhaps for better or worse. But at least at the time, the gold standard was not ripping out existing features and then selling them back to gamers like it is today. So yes, 2002 was clearly a critical year in the history of FPS games specifically, but it wasn't just FPS games that had a good year then as well. For example, if you were a fan of the skateboarding genre at the time, then 2002 was also a good year because it was the year that gave you games such as Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4, as well as aggressive inline. And yes, for those who don't know, the skateboarding trick genre was essentially undergoing its golden age in the early 2000s. So bringing up gaming in the early 2000s kind of requires bringing up the skateboarding genre. Something else I should bring up though is that 2002 also proved to be one of the most influential years for fans of the Nintendo GameCube. I already mentioned the release of Metroid Prime, but 2002 is also the year that gave us the likes of Super Mario Sunshine as well as Wind Waker. Unfortunately for Nintendo though, it is worth mentioning that this is also the year that firmly cemented the GameCube's reputation as being the kid-friendly console of that generation, even more so than the Nintendo 64 was for its generation. And at a time when being edgy was all the rage, that didn't exactly translate very well into sales for the general public. This is likely what convinced Nintendo on doing something a little bit more drastic for their next console, to try to regain the public's attention. Nevertheless though, 2002 itself was a great year for the GameCube for very obvious reasons, and people who are fans of the system will no doubt regard that year quite fondly. Curiously, even movie licensed games had a pretty good run in 2002, amusing considering that movie licensed games even by that point had a pretty sketchy reputation. But this was ultimately the year that gave us games such as Spider-Man, the aforementioned 007 Nightfire, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Though fans of the latter two examples will no doubt know that you had to be picky about which exact system you played those games on, because one quirk of games in that particular era is that they often had completely different versions depending on which exact system you played them on, to the tune that in some cases they would completely switch genres altogether. But by now I hope you can see why I believe that 2002 was very much an overlooked year in terms of its importance on the video game industry. Yes, it wasn't quite as flashy as 2001, however the changes that did occur were quite substantial indeed. With that in mind, let's move on to another year that I would argue gets somewhat overlooked in terms of its importance, namely 2003. 2003, of course, proved to be another major year for World War II themed FPS games, as it was the year that gave us games such as Medal of Honor Rising Sun, Hidden and Dangerous 2, and, of course, most important of all, the original Call of Duty. That last game being made by developers who had originally worked on Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Even by this point, however, there were clear signs of where the video game industry was going to be going in the next few years. Two examples that immediately come to mind were the Desert Combat mod for Battlefield 1942, the mod itself appearing to be released sometime in early 2003, as well as Command & Conquer Generals, which itself was released in February of 2003. Both of these were Modern Warfare-themed titles that became incredibly popular following the then brand new war in Iraq. Both of these in their own way helped lay the groundwork for popularizing the Modern Warfare-themed setting, which itself would ultimately become the default setting from the late 2000s to the mid-2010s. Now granted, these were far from the first games or mods to have a Modern Warfare setting. It is, however, very clear that their success, like I said, helped lay the groundwork for future games. 2003 would also be quite an important year for the RTS genre, as it proved to be quite a year of transition indeed, with the aforementioned Command & Conquer Generals being an example typical of old-school base-building RTS mechanics, whereas by the year's end we saw the release of Rise of Nations, a game whose unique economic mechanics played a huge role in influencing RTS games in the near future. I should also mention by this point that the market for PC games was already well and truly starting to change significantly in its own right. The big box releases of old were becoming increasingly rare, being at this point replaced more commonly with small box releases, which in terms of size were comparable to VHS tapes, though typically slightly bigger. As one may guess, there were fewer goodies being placed into these small box releases, the manuals themselves often being more pocketbook sized, though depending on the complexity of the game could still be quite fat indeed. Don't get me wrong, big box releases would still be a thing for at least a little bit, but times were very clearly changing. It's worth noting, for the record, that even by the late 90s, game journalists were trying to argue that PC gaming was dying, and that the end of PC gaming in total was near, presumably with the same notion that game journalists would try to argue in 2014 that gamers are dead, and we all know exactly how that went. Getting back to the topic at hand, however, 2003 did have one major innovation that would ultimately impact PC gamers, arguably more than any other in history. For you see, it was in 2003 that Valve decided to first officially release Steam. What was initially a humble attempt to make it easier to patch video games would eventually balloon into the largest online storefront ever to exist. It is of note, however, that this was ultimately a slow process that took a number of years to happen, so we will be getting back to that in the future. In the meantime, though, let's move on to 2004, which, just like 2001, has become remembered as one of the most important years in video game history. This was, after all, the year that gave us Far Cry, Halo 2, Rome Total War, Warhammer 40k Dawn of War, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Star Wars Battlefront, World of Warcraft, Spider-Man 2, Call of Duty Finest Hour, Metal Gear Solid 3, and of course, Half-Life 2. While when it comes to the hardware side of things, 2004 was the year that gave us the Nintendo DS, as well as the Japanese release of the PSP, meaning it was also a massive technological leap in the realm of handheld gaming. To say that 2004 was a big year in video game history is very much an understatement. That said, I must confess that not every trend that took off in 2004 2004 stuck around very long when it came to video game history. For example, 2004 was curiously also the rise of the Vietnam-themed FPS, with releases such as Battlefield Vietnam, Conflict Vietnam, and Men of Valor, all releasing in 2004 with the hopes of overtaking the World War II-themed FPS games. Considering the comparative obscurity of these games, including the relative obscurity that Battlefield Vietnam has in relation to both its predecessor and successor, it should come as no surprise that this little trend didn't go very far. That's not to say these were bad games, they just simply failed to rock the boat the way they had hoped. Amusingly, the big jungle-themed FPS of the day was, of course, Far Cry, the first title to use the now legendary Cry engine. And while it absolutely was a power hog at the time, it also enabled Far Cry to be an absolutely gorgeous game that could pull off the amount of foliage required to sell the illusion of a massive jungle. A particularly impressive feat given the relatively open level design that Far Cry went with. Now, admittedly, the original Far Cry was not a sandbox, unlike later entries of the franchise. Nevertheless, the feats that this particular game accomplished were nothing short of praiseworthy. Going back to the topic of trends that were going on in 2004, though, there is one that I should bring up that has stuck around, thanks very specifically to Halo 2, which became memeable for having a special edition release, something that was unique enough that people were actively making fun of at the time, and something that amusingly backfired for scalpers who tried to buy all the special edition releases, only to discover that the base version of the game ended up becoming more valuable in the long run. Still, I believe the trend of selling multiple premium versions of games could be traced back here, even though the special goodies in the special edition version weren't really actual in-game content. That said, I don't want the memory of Halo 2 just to be the fact that it had a special release, because the game itself was an absolute masterpiece in the franchise, being an enormous improvement over the original game, and visually speaking, another treat from the era. In fact, 2004 was a great year for video game graphics all around, because going back to examples such as Rome Total War and Warhammer 40k Dawn of War, both of those games ended up being massive technical achievements that resulted in Rome Total War getting used by historical documentaries to recreate historical battles, and Dawn of War to be one of the very few RTS games to have the distinction of earning an M rating. And where would I be talking about the technical achievements of video games in 2004 were I not to bring up Half-Life 2, an absolutely revolutionary title that became a brand new landmark for things like video game physics. There's a reason why Gary's mod, which was first released in 2004 and has gone down in history as one of the most successful video game mods of all time, was built upon the Source engine. It was and still is the sandbox mod of choice. Speaking of stuff from 2004 that's still widely played today, I have to also bring up World of Warcraft, one of the finest games ever created by Blizzard during its absolute peak. A game that absolutely dominated the MMO genre for nearly a decade, and even now continuously gets updated with new expansion packs. Yes, World of Warcraft is a game from 2004 that still gets expansion packs to this day. So yes, for very obvious reasons, 2004 is remembered very fondly within the annals of video game history. But let's now move on to 2005. Another great year in video game history that kind of gets underrated, but nevertheless absolutely deserves to be talked about more. 2005 was the year that gave us games such as Call of Duty 2, God of War, Resident Evil 4, Psychonauts, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory, Star Wars Battlefront 2, Battlefield 2, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, Call of Duty Big Red 1, Shadow of the Colossus, Fear, Advance Wars Dual Strike, Time Splitters Future Perfect, Battalion Wars, Silent Hunter 3, Age of Empires 3, and Civilization 4. 2005 was a massive year, and not just for the games themselves, but also for some of the new changes that were occurring within the industry. Not only was this the year that gave us the Xbox 360, and thus the start of the 7th generation of consoles, but it was also the year that Valve decided to allow third-party games to be sold on Steam, evolving it from a simple app that was meant to make it easier to update games into the first iteration of the proper storefront that we know today. Though admittedly at this point Valve was still very stringent on what games did and didn't get on Steam, for better or worse. Unsurprisingly, from a technical standpoint, 2005 proved to be a substantial leap. On the one hand, that does make sense given that, once again, this was the year that gave us the Xbox 360. As a result, games such as Call of Duty 2 looked absolutely gorgeous for the time. But even on the older hardware of the original Xbox, there were some absolutely fantastic looking games, such as, of course, Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. And of course, when it comes to pushing the envelope of video game graphics, I do have to once again bring up the original Fear, as it was ultimately the game that replaced Far Cry as the go-to game to test just how powerful your computer build is. It is worth noting, however, that the technological improvements found in 2005 led to some rather interesting consequences. One such example has to deal with the fact that the Xbox 360 was such a technological leap from a hardware standpoint, provided it worked and didn't have the red ring of death, that is. But assuming it did work, the Xbox 360 was such a powerful machine for the time that it was actively competitive even against the most modern gaming PCs of the day. And remember those game journalists who were publishing articles claiming that PC gaming was dying? Well, this latest turn of events caused those articles to skyrocket in terms of popularity for the next few years. Admittedly, the dark age of PC gaming wouldn't really occur until 2007, but considering the years of development that most games took at that point, it would appear apparent that this is around the time that major publishers decided to really cut back on the number of PC games they were making, especially when it came to PC exclusives. That's not to say that innovations weren't happening within the realm of PC gaming specifically in 2005 though, as this was around the time that major publishers were starting to replace CDs with DVDs, which significantly reduced the number of discs needed to hold a single game. It was also around the time that the small box packaging itself was being replaced by the plastic box packaging, which was, if nothing else, at least a sturdier design. Leaving the realms of PC gaming, however, and going back into the story of console gaming, it is also of note that one of the most important releases of 2005 wasn't a game per se, but rather a map pack. Namely, the Halo 2 multiplayer map pack, which, considering this was still 2005, had a physical release, which included not only 9 brand new maps, but also the latest update for Halo 2, just in case you didn't have the latest patch. Needless to say, this was an exceptionally rare thing back in the day, though not entirely unheard of. One could look at, for example, the Maps of Death map pack for the 3DO version of Return Fire as a much older example of a non-standalone map pack being released as a console exclusive. But still, this was, like I said, extremely rare. Speaking of extremely rare things when it came to console gaming, I must also bring up a certain trend that took place in 2005 specifically, that being the rise of map editors being put into console games. Now, admittedly, map editors have been a long-standing feature in the realm of PC gaming specifically. They were, however, a still relatively new idea when it came to the console market. So it was in fact quite notable for games such as, for example, Pariah, and far more notably Far Cry Instincts, to release onto consoles with proper map editor support. Now granted, in the case of the appropriately named Pariah, this was a relatively mid game, whose only standout feature at the time was the map editor itself. The same, however, could not be said for Far Cry Instincts, as that game was a legitimately impressive title, whose combination of on-foot combat as well as vehicles, and with Far Cry Instincts being Far Cry Instincts superpowers now, the ability to create and then share your own maps over Xbox Live, made that particular game stand out all that little bit more. There is, however, another major development I need to bring up that occurred in 2005, specifically the creation of a brand new genre of game altogether. This was, after all, the year that gave us the first Guitar Hero game, which quickly took the world by storm, being the new fad genre for casual gamers during the mid to late 2000s. Admittedly, there's not too much I can say about this, because admittedly the draw for the games are rather self-explanatory, what with the combination of good music and easy to learn if somewhat repetitive and addictive gameplay, but considering the age of video games that I'm talking about, I kind of have to mention it at least in passing here. One thing I do need to touch on a little bit more though has to deal with Battlefield 2 and its spin-off Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, as these games I believe played a significant role in what was to come for FPS games, as I believe they were something of a missing link between the earlier aforementioned Desert Combat and Command & Conquer Generals to the much more famous Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. For a start, when Battlefield 2 was developed, DICE had employed members of the Desert Combat modding team, specifically to help create this game, causing an obvious link there. It's with Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, though, that things get rather interesting. This is because, in the most charitable terms, it could be said that Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare was heavily inspired by the writing and gameplay of Battlefield 2 Modern Combat, and less charitably and more honestly described as completely ripping off the writing and gameplay of Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. Remember the mission in COD 4 where you have to go and inspect a tanker and then find out that it's been hijacked by bad guys and you have to escape it? Well, that's a mission in Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. Remember that one level in COD 4 where you have to assault enemy bunkers in order to prevent Armageddon? That too is also from Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. Hell, remember the kill streak system that was in COD 4? Yeah, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat had a kill streak system as well. So needless to say, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat is a game that deserves far more credit than it gets these days due to the impact that it had on the industry as well. And if there is any game that best describes 2005 as a year for video game history, it is ultimately Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. A highly influential moment in video game history that ultimately gets overlooked by what came both before and after. I believe now is the perfect time to reflect on just how impactful the 6th generation truly was when it came to video game history. Keep in mind, most of what I have discussed here occurred in just 4 years. In just 4 years, console games went from being dominated by platformers and split-screen multiplayer to instead first-person shooters and online multiplayer. These 4 short years ended up writing the rulebook for motion controls done right, for DLC, for special edition releases for console games, and for online storefronts, including both Steam and the Xbox Live Arcade. In these 4 short years, developers had created the Cry engine, the Source engine, and the Unity engine. In these 4 short years, we ended up with Garry's Mod and World of Warcraft, both of which remain mainstream and popular to this very day. In these 4 short years, we saw the rise of sandbox games, of regenerating health, of the early rise of modern warfare-themed first-person shooters. To say that the 6th generation of consoles was influential is an understatement. It was an absolute watershed moment. It was one of the most important console generations in history. It was both the last of the old and the first of the new. With all of that in mind, I trust you understand now on why I've been so keen on making a long-form essay on this very specific topic. I also must now take the time to thank all of you who have decided to stick around to the end of this video, and I hope you have found out a few things that you might not have necessarily known before. But with all of that said, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.